The station was the largest thing ever built by any living species. It hung in the darkness between two dead stars, like a city made of glass and metal, stretching out in every direction for miles. Thousands of ships docked along its outer rings every day. Millions of beings lived and worked inside its walls. The Valeran Dominion had constructed it over 3,000 years ago as a symbol of their power, and it had served that purpose well. No one who entered the grand chamber at its center ever forgot how small they were. Danny Cole had never been here before. He walked through the enormous corridor that led to the chamber entrance, his shoes clicking against the smooth stone floor. The ceiling above him was so high that clouds of vapor drifted near the top, lit from below by pale blue lights embedded in the walls. Statues of Dominion rulers lined both sides of the hallway, each one carved from a single block of dark stone, each one depicting a species that stood 8 feet tall, with scaled skin and narrow golden eyes. He did not slow down to admire any of it. Katie Morgan walked beside him, carrying a thin data tablet under her arm. She was 29 years old, sharp-faced, and had spent the last 4 years studying alien legal systems at the United Nations Stellar Affairs Division back on Earth. She had prepared for this moment for months. Her fingers were steady, but Danny could see the tension in her jaw. "How many are in there?" Danny asked without looking at her. "Over 600 delegates," Katie said. 42 species represented. The full conclave." Danny nodded. He adjusted the cuffs of his dark suit and kept walking. Humanity had only been traveling between stars for about 60 years. In that time, they had built a handful of colonies on the outer rim of explored space, set up trade routes with a few neighboring species, and mostly kept to themselves. To the elder races of the galaxy, humans were barely worth noticing. They lived short lives. Their technology was generations behind. Their territory was small. Most alien diplomats could not even point to Earth on a star chart. The Dominion had summoned them to this conclave, though no human had requested the audience. Danny had received the summons 3 weeks ago aboard a transit station near human space. The message had been formal, but dismissive, listing a series of alleged trade violations committed by human merchant ships near Dominion shipping corridors. The tone made it clear that humanity was expected to appear, apologize, and accept whatever restrictions the Dominion chose to impose. Danny had read the summons once, set it down, and then spent the next 3 weeks preparing something else entirely. The doors to the grand chamber were 40 feet tall and made of a metal that seemed to absorb light. 2 Dominion guards stood on either side, each one armed with energy lances that hummed faintly. They looked down at Danny and Katie with open disinterest. One of them gestured for the humans to enter. The chamber inside was vast. Rows of curved seating rose upward on every side like the inside of a bowl, filled with hundreds of alien delegates. Some were tall and thin, with translucent skin. Others were broad and armored, their bodies built for worlds with crushing gravity. A few floated in levitation fields, their forms barely solid. The noise was a low, constant hum of dozens of languages being spoken at once, filtered through translation devices embedded in the walls. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform made of white stone. Behind it sat the High Arbiter of the Conclave, a Dominion elder named Zythar Voss. He was enormous even by Dominion standards, nearly 9 feet tall, with deep green scales and eyes like polished gold coins. His voice, when he spoke, carried through the chamber without any amplification, low and heavy, like the sound of stone grinding against stone. Danny and Katie were directed to a small area near the base of the platform, designated for minor species. The seats around them were occupied by delegates from other small civilizations, most of whom sat quietly with their heads down. None of them made eye contact with the Dominion officials above. Zythar Voss began the proceedings by reading a long list of administrative matters. Border disputes between two mid-tier empires. A resource allocation disagreement in a shared star system. A complaint from a merchant guild about tariff changes. Each matter was handled quickly and with absolute authority. The Dominion's word was final. No one argued. After nearly an hour, Zythar Voss turned his golden eyes toward the human delegation. He read out the list of alleged trade violations in a flat, bored tone. Human merchant vessels had allegedly crossed into restricted Dominion trade corridors on 4 separate occasions. One human cargo ship had reportedly failed to transmit proper identification codes when passing through a Dominion checkpoint. The infractions were minor. The tone was not. Zythar Voss referred to humanity as a developing curiosity, and suggested that the humans accept a new set of shipping restrictions that would effectively cut them off from 3 of their most important trade routes. He did not frame it as a negotiation. He framed it as a correction, the way an adult might correct a child who had wandered somewhere they did not belong. Several delegates in the upper rows chuckled openly. A few made remarks in their own languages that the translation systems rendered as variations of "how amusing" and "they send children to speak for them." Danny sat through all of it without moving. His hands rested on his knees. His expression did not change. Katie sat beside him, her tablet on her lap, her eyes fixed on the data scrolling across its surface. When Zythar Voss finished reading, and the chamber settled into a satisfied silence, he looked down at Danny and asked in a tone that expected nothing of substance in return. "Does the human delegation wish to respond?" Danny stood up slowly. He buttoned his jacket with one hand and stepped forward to the edge of the speaker's platform. He looked up at Zythar Voss, then turned and looked out across the 600 delegates filling the chamber. He took a breath. "Before we address your list," Danny said, his voice calm and clear, "I need to raise a matter of our own." A few delegates shifted in their seats. This was unusual. Minor species did not raise counterclaims at the conclave. It simply was not done. Zythar Voss tilted his massive head slightly, the way a predator might tilt its head at a sound it did not expect. "You may speak briefly," he said. Danny nodded once. He looked out at the chamber again, making sure every eye was on him. Then he said it. 14 months ago, a Valeran Dominion battle fleet entered the Sol system without authorization and opened fire on Earth. The sound in the chamber did not fade gradually. It stopped. Every voice, every whisper, every rustle of movement ceased at once, as if someone had pulled the air out of the room. 600 delegates from 42 species sat in absolute silence and stared at the small human standing alone on the speaker's platform. Danny did not blink. He did not look away. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and waited for the silence to do its work. Katie Morgan opened her tablet and prepared the first file. The conclave of sovereigns had been running for over 9,000 years. In all that time, nothing like this had ever happened. And Danny Cole was only getting started. The resolution was brought before the full conclave on the morning of the 4th day. The Grand Chamber was more crowded than it had been at the start of the proceedings. Word had spread across the station, and delegations that had not originally planned to attend had sent representatives to witness what was happening. The upper rows were packed. The observation galleries, normally empty, were filled with journalists, scholars, and officials from species that rarely involved themselves in galactic politics. Danny Cole stood at the speaker's platform one more time. Katie Morgan stood beside him, and behind them, in a row that had been mostly empty 4 days ago, sat representatives from 23 species. The Tassari, the Ondreth, and the Havali were there, but so were others, civilizations that had been quiet for centuries, species that had accepted their place at the bottom of the galactic order because they believed they had no other choice. Now they were standing together for the first time. Danny read the resolution aloud. It was 3 pages long, written in precise legal language that Katie had spent 2 sleepless nights perfecting. The resolution demanded a full independent investigation into the activities of the Iron Veil. It demanded reparations for every species that had been targeted by unauthorized military strikes. It demanded the arrest and prosecution of Draven Cole and every officer who had participated in or authorized the attacks. And it called for the creation of a new body, the Outer Rim Compact, a formal alliance with legal standing under galactic law that would give smaller species collective security guarantees and a unified voice in governance. When Danny finished reading, Zythar Voss stood at the podium. The chamber fell silent. Every delegate knew that the arbiter's response would determine the outcome. Zythar Voss spoke slowly and carefully. He acknowledged that the Dominion had failed in its duty to prevent the actions of the Iron Veil. He stated that the Dominion accepted responsibility for the harm caused and would cooperate fully with the investigation. He endorsed the resolution in its entirety. It was by any measure the most significant political shift in galactic history since the founding of the Conclave itself. The vote that followed was not close. The resolution passed with the support of 39 of the 42 species represented. The 3 who abstained were close military allies of the Dominion who could not bring themselves to vote against their patron, but also could not bring themselves to vote against the evidence. Their abstention spoke louder than any objection would have. Draven Cole was arrested that same day. He was taken from his personal warship, the Sovereign's Blade, by Dominion internal security forces, who boarded the vessel while it was docked at a military station 3 systems away. Reports said he did not resist. He reportedly looked at the officers who came for him and said only, "This changes nothing. The weak will always need to be managed." He was wrong, but he would not live long enough to understand that. His senior officers were arrested over the following weeks. The Iron Veil's fleet was seized. Its command structure was dissolved. Intelligence files recovered from its headquarters revealed the full scope of its operations. Over 40 unauthorized strikes against minor species, conducted over a period of nearly 300 years. Entire civilizations had been crippled or destroyed in secret, and no one had ever been held accountable. Until now. The Outer Rim Compact was formally established 6 weeks after the vote. Its founding members included Earth, the Tessari Confederation, the Ondreth Collective, the Havali Republic, and 19 other species. Danny Cole was nominated as the Compact's first human representative, a position he accepted quietly and without ceremony. The Compact's charter was simple. Any attack against one member would be considered an attack against all. Military resources would be shared, intelligence would be pooled, and every member species, regardless of size or technological development, would have an equal vote in the Compact's governing council. It was not a perfect system. Danny knew that. Katie knew that. Everyone involved knew that alliances were fragile things, held together by trust that had not yet been tested by time. But it was a beginning. 3 months after the founding of the Compact, a ceremony was held aboard the orbital station. It was a small event, not a grand celebration. He told Katie that he did not want speeches about victory or triumph. He wanted something else. The chamber chosen for the ceremony was modest by the station standards. A circular room with a domed ceiling that showed a live feed of the stars outside. Representatives from the Compact's member species gathered in rows of simple chairs. There were no podiums, no raised platforms, no hierarchy in the seating arrangement. Danny stood at the front of the room. He was wearing the same dark suit he had worn on the first day of the conclave. He held a single sheet of paper in his hand. He began by reading 3 names. Not the names of ships or fleets or officers. The names of the 3 cities on Earth that had been struck by the Dominion's weapons 14 months ago. He read each name slowly, letting the sound of it fill the room before moving to the next. Then he read from the paper. It was a passage from a letter written by a woman named Laura Bishop. She had been a school teacher in one of the cities that was hit. She had survived the attack by sheltering in a basement with 14 of her students. In the months that followed, while the world above her rebuilt itself, Laura had organized a shelter for displaced children in the ruins of her school. She had written the letter to a friend, never intending for it to be read publicly. Danny read only a small part of it, the part where Laura described the morning after the attack, when the dust had settled and the fires had mostly gone out, and she had walked outside to find that someone had already started clearing rubble from the street. She did not know who it was. She never found out. But she wrote that it was the most important thing she had ever seen, because it meant that even in the worst moment, someone had decided to build instead of break. Danny folded the paper and looked out at the assembled delegates. Several of them, beings from species with very different bodies and very different ways of expressing emotion, were visibly moved. The Tessari ambassador, Mivari, had closed her silver eyes. The Andreth delegate sat with all four hands pressed flat against his knees, a gesture that Danny had learned meant deep respect in Andreth culture. The Havali representative's feathered ridges had flattened against her skull, a sign of grief, honored. Danny did not give a speech about power or strategy or the future of galactic politics. He said only that the purpose of the compact was not to make humanity or any other species dominant. It was to make sure that what had been done to Earth, to Tessera Minor, to the Andreth mining stations, to the Havali generation ship, would never be done to anyone again. He said that strength was not just the ability to build warships. It was the decision to reach across the distance between worlds and help someone you had never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. After the ceremony, Danny and Katie walked through the observation deck on the station's outer ring. The wide viewport stretched from floor to ceiling, showing the vast darkness of space, dotted with the light of billions of stars. In the distance, barely visible, a small cluster of lights moved in formation, human and allied ships patrolling together for the first time. Katie was quiet for a while. Then she asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Do you think it will last?" Danny looked out at the stars. He thought about the fleet holding position near the Sol system. He thought about the 23 species that had signed a charter built on nothing more than a shared belief that things could be better. He thought about Scythar Voss standing alone in his chamber, choosing to bend rather than break. He thought about Draven Cole sitting in a cell, still believing that fear was the only language the galaxy understood. And he thought about Laura Bishop, standing in the ruins of her school, watching a stranger clear rubble from the street. "Nothing lasts forever," Danny said. "But right now, for the first time, they know who we are, and that matters." Katie nodded. They stood together in silence, watching the stars. 6 months later, on a quiet Tuesday morning on Earth, Laura Bishop sat at the desk in her rebuilt classroom. The windows were new, the walls still smelled faintly of fresh paint, and 22 children were playing in the yard outside. On her screen was a message. It had been routed through 3 relay stations and translated from a language she had never heard of. It was from a Tessari family on a world called Tessera Minor. They had read about her work rebuilding shelters for displaced children. Their own world was still recovering from its own attack, and they had children who needed the same kind of help. They wanted to know if she would be willing to come. Laura sat at her desk for a long time, reading the message over and over. She looked out the window at her students. She looked at the sky beyond them, pale blue and cloudless, the same sky that had burned orange 14 months ago. Then she turned back to her screen and began to type. She had never been to the stars before, but she had always known how to build something from nothing. The conclave session was suspended within an hour of Danny Cole's presentation. It was the first unscheduled suspension in over 600 years. The delegates filed out of the grand chamber in near silence, most of them clutching data tablets loaded with the evidence package that Katie Morgan had distributed. The corridors of the station buzzed with whispered conversations in 100 different languages, all of them circling the same question. How had this happened, without anyone knowing? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Behind the sealed doors of the Dominion's private council chamber, Zythar Voss convened an emergency session with the 12 senior members of the Dominion's ruling circle. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of the second hour, 3 of the 12 had turned on each other. The attack on Earth, and the attacks on the Tasari, Andreth, and Havali before it, had not been authorized by the Dominion civilian government. They had been carried out by a faction within the Dominion military known as the Iron Veil, a secretive command structure that operated independently of the ruling circle and answered only to its own leadership. The Iron Veil had existed for centuries, originally created as an intelligence and enforcement arm tasked with maintaining order on the Dominion's borders. Over time, it had grown beyond its original purpose. It had become something else entirely. The Iron Veil's commander was a Dominion officer named Draven Cole. He was old even by Dominion standards, over 400 years, and he had spent the last 2 centuries building the Iron Veil into a shadow military with its own fleet, its own supply chains, and its own agenda. Draven Cole believed that the only way to maintain the Dominion supremacy was to ensure that no minor species ever grew strong enough to challenge it. His method was simple and brutal. Identify any small civilization that showed signs of growth, ambition, or technological progress, and destroy its capacity to develop before it became a threat. The attacks were never reported. The victims were chosen specifically because they were too small, too isolated, and too afraid to speak up. For decades, the strategy had worked. Species on the outer rim stayed quiet, stayed small, and stayed obedient. The Dominion's position at the top of the galactic order remained unchallenged. Until Earth. Draven Cole had made a mistake. He had treated humanity the same way he had treated every other minor species, as a problem to be crushed before it could grow. But humans were not like the others. They did not collapse. They did not hide. They buried their dead. They closed their doors. And they built a war machine in 14 months that should have taken a century. Now the secret was out, and it was out in front of the entire galactic diplomatic community. Danny Cole did not rest during the suspension. He and Katie Morgan set up a temporary operations room in the small quarters assigned to the human delegation, a room that was barely large enough for 4 people, and had clearly been chosen to remind them of their low status. Danny did not care about the size of the room. He cared about the 27 messages that arrived on his secure channel within the first 3 hours. 12 of those messages were from minor species delegations requesting private meetings. 6 were from mid-tier civilizations that had previously refused to acknowledge humanity's existence. 3 were from Dominion vassal states asking, very carefully and through encrypted channels, whether the human coalition was accepting new members. Katie sorted through the messages, while Danny met with each delegation one at a time. He was patient with every single one of them. He listened to their fears, their grievances, and their questions. He did not pressure anyone. He did not make threats. He simply laid out the facts and let each delegate decide for themselves what they wanted to do. The Tessari ambassador, whose name was Mivery, came to see him first. She was the one who had spoken in the chamber, the one who had confirmed the attack on her people. She sat across from Danny in the cramped room, and told him something she had not said publicly. The Tessari had been considering surrendering their remaining colonies to the Dominion entirely, giving up their independence in exchange for the promise that no more attacks would come. Danny listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said simply that she and her people deserved better than that, and that they did not have to face this alone anymore. Mivari looked at him for a long time. Then she asked him a question that many others would ask in the hours that followed. Why did you help us? You had enough evidence to present your own case. You did not need to include the Tessari, the Ondreth, or the Havali. You could have kept the focus on Earth alone. Danny leaned back in his chair. Because this was never just about Earth, he said. If we win this fight alone, nothing changes. The Iron Veil gets punished for attacking humans, and then some other faction does the same thing to the next small species that gets in their way. The only way to actually change anything is to make sure that what happened to us, and to you, can never happen to anyone again. Mivari nodded slowly. She stood, extended her hand the way she had seen humans do in diplomatic recordings, and Danny shook it. By the end of the first day, Danny and Katie had met with delegations from 16 species. By the end of the second day, a formal coalition had begun to take shape, with representatives drafting a joint resolution to be presented when the conclave reconvened. On the evening of the second day, Danny received a message requesting a private meeting with Zythar Voss. He went alone. The High Arbiter's personal chamber was enormous, as everything in the Dominion seemed to be. The walls were lined with carvings that depicted the history of the Valeran species, from their earliest civilizations to their conquest of the stars. Zythar Voss stood near a wide viewport that looked out over the station's exterior, his massive scaled body silhouetted against the faint light of distant stars. He did not turn around when Danny entered. The Iron Veil will be dismantled, Zythar Voss said. His voice was quieter than Danny had heard it in the chamber. Draven Cole and his senior officers will be arrested. This has already been ordered. Danny waited. Zythar Voss turned to face him. His golden eyes studied the human the way a scientist might study a new organism. Not with contempt this time, but with genuine curiosity. You have put me in a difficult position, the Arbiter said. If I oppose your resolution, the coalition you have built will frame the entire Dominion as complicit. Our vassal states are already restless. Several of them have contacted your delegation directly. If this fractures further, it could destabilize the entire structure of the Dominion. He simply stood and listened. If I support your resolution, Zythar Voss continued, I admit publicly that the Dominion failed to control its own military. I admit that for decades, a rogue faction operated within our borders and committed atrocities in our name. The damage to our authority will be severe. Yes, Danny said, it will. Zythar Voss studied him. You are not going to make this easy for me, are you? No, Danny said, I am not. A long silence stretched between them. Then Zythar Voss asked the question that seemed to have been building behind his eyes since the moment Danny first stood on the speaker's platform. How, he said, how does a species that has only been in space for 60 years prepare for something like this? How do you build a fleet, decode our ciphers, unite 4 species in secret, and walk into this chamber as if you have been doing this for 1,000 years? Danny looked up at the Arbiter. He thought about the question for a moment, and then he answered it honestly. Because we have been doing this to each other for thousands of years, he said. War, diplomacy, espionage, coalition building. We have been practicing all of it since before we had electricity. You are not the first empire to look at us and see something small and easy to break. You are just the latest. Zythar Voss stared at him for a long time. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. I will support your resolution, he said. Danny nodded. Thank you. He turned and walked out of the chamber. As he made his way back through the corridor, he pulled out a small communication device and typed a short encrypted message to a ship commander waiting on the far side of the Sol system. The message read, Diplomatic path confirmed. Hold position. Do not stand down. Aboard the USS Nathan Perry, Fleet Commander Sam Harper read the message, exhaled slowly, and relayed the order to his 317 other ships. Hold position. Stay ready. The holographic projection that appeared above the speaker's platform was not a recording this time. It was a live feed. The image showed a region of space near the outer boundary of the Sol system, past the orbit of Neptune, where the light of Earth's sun was just a bright dot among millions. Floating in that darkness was a fleet. Not a handful of patrol ships or a cluster of armed transports, but a proper war fleet, the kind that only elder civilizations were supposed to be able to build. 318 warships hung in formation across a stretch of space wider than the distance between Earth and its moon. The smallest of them were fast attack frigates, sleek and sharp-edged, built for speed and precision strikes. The largest were capital ships, massive vessels bristling with weapon arrays and shielded by layers of armor plating that caught the faint starlight and reflected it back in cold silver. 600 delegates stared at the projection with the kind of silence that comes not from calm but from shock. Danny Cole stood beneath the image and let them look. He gave them 10 full seconds before he spoke. "This is the United Earth Defense Fleet," he said. 318 combat-ready vessels constructed over the last 14 months across every shipyard, orbital foundry, and industrial station in human space. He gestured to the projection, and Katie Morgan zoomed the image in on the largest ship at the center of the formation. It was a Dreadnought-class carrier, over 2 miles long, with a broad, flat flight deck running along its dorsal spine, and heavy gun batteries mounted on its forward hull. The ship was painted matte black, with a single designation printed in white along its port side. "The USS Nathan Perry," Danny said, "Dreadnought carrier, crew of 4,000, capable of deploying 600 strike craft. She was built in orbit above Mars in 9 months, which our engineers tell me is a new record." He pointed to 2 slightly smaller vessels flanking the carrier, the USS Cora Dawson and the USS Eli Sutton, heavy siege platforms, designed to crack orbital fortifications and planetary defense grids. Each one carries enough firepower to reduce a mid-sized moon to rubble. The delegates were not laughing anymore. Several Dominion military advisors in the upper rows had risen from their seats and were speaking urgently into communication devices. Zythar Voss remained at the podium, his golden eyes fixed on the projection, his expression unreadable. Danny continued. "When the Dominion attacked Earth, you destroyed 3 of our cities and killed over 200,000 of our people. You expected that to be the end of the story. You expected us to be afraid, to stay quiet, to accept our place at the bottom of your order." He shook his head slowly. "Instead, we activated something called the Forge Compact. It is a wartime industrial protocol that has existed since the first decade of human space travel. Every colony, every station, every factory in human space is part of it. When the compact is activated, everything shifts to military production. Everything. Civilian manufacturing stops, luxury goods stop, non-essential construction stops. Every furnace, every fabrication line, every engineer and every welder works toward one goal." He let the weight of that settle over the room. "You thought our orbital foundries above Earth and Mars were civilian facilities. They were. But they were built with dual-purpose architecture from the very beginning. It took us 6 days to convert them to full military output after the attack. 6 days. Katie Morgan brought up a secondary display showing production statistics. Ship hulls completed per week. Weapon systems manufactured per month. Crew training cycles completed across human space. The numbers were staggering, not because they matched the Dominion's total military capacity, but because they had been achieved in just over a year by a species that the galaxy had considered irrelevant. "We also did something else," Danny said. He nodded to Katie, and she brought up a new set of files. After the attack, we sent out quiet messages to every minor species on the Outer Rim. Not public communications, private ones, encrypted and delivered by courier ships to avoid Dominion signal monitoring. We asked a simple question: has this happened to you? The chamber stirred. A few delegates from the upper rows exchanged uneasy glances. 3 species responded, Danny said. The Tessari, the Ondreth, and the Havali. At the mention of those names, a ripple of movement passed through the chamber. The Tessari delegation, a group of slender, pale-skinned beings seated in the lower rows, looked up sharply. The Ondreth ambassador, a heavy-set figure with 4 arms and deep-set black eyes, leaned forward. The Havali delegate, a tall being with feathered ridges along its skull, stood up from its seat. Each of these species, Danny said, suffered attacks similar to ours, unauthorized strikes by Dominion military forces against civilian targets. No warnings, no demands, no communication. The attacks were designed to terrorize, to keep these species small, quiet, and obedient. He paused and looked up at the rows of elder race delegates who had sat comfortably in their seats for centuries, passing judgment on civilizations they considered beneath them. None of them reported the attacks, Danny said, because they were afraid. Afraid that speaking up would bring a larger response. Afraid that no one would believe them. Afraid that the conclave itself was complicit. The Tessari ambassador stood. She was barely 5 feet tall, with wide silver eyes, and a voice that came through the translation system as a soft, clear tone. She looked at Danny, and he nodded to her. He speaks the truth, she said. The Dominion struck our colony on Tessara Minor 3 years ago. 40,000 of our people died. We said nothing because we believed we had no choice. The Ondreth ambassador rose next. His voice was deeper, rougher, translated as a low growl. The Ondreth mining stations in the coal reach were destroyed 2 years ago. We were told it was a navigational accident. It was not. The Havali delegate spoke last. Her voice was high and musical, but the words were heavy. The Havali lost an entire generation ship. 11,000 souls. We were warned that if we spoke of it, the next strike would target our homeworld. The chamber was no longer the same room it had been an hour ago. The comfortable certainty that had defined the conclave for thousands of years was cracking apart in real time. Delegates who had never spoken to each other were turning in their seats, looking at one another with new eyes. Danny waited until the 3 testimonies had settled into the silence. Then he spoke again. Over the last 14 months, humanity has worked with the Tessari, the Ondreth, and the Havali to build a mutual defense agreement. Our fleets are linked. Our intelligence networks are shared. Our shipyards have been helping them build their own warships using the same designs we developed. He looked at Scythar Voss. You assumed we would do what every other small species has done. You assumed we would be afraid, that we would hide, that we would wait for someone else to save us. Danny took a step closer to the podium. His voice did not rise, but something in it hardened, like iron cooling in water. You were wrong, he said. We are not here to ask for your protection. We are not here to request justice. We are here to inform you that the balance of power in this galaxy has already changed, and you are the last ones to know. He straightened his jacket and looked out at the chamber one final time. What happens next is up to you, but I suggest you choose carefully. He turned and walked back to his seat beside Katie. She looked at him as he sat down. Her face was still, but her eyes were bright. In the upper rows, Scythar Voss stared at the projection of the human fleet, still floating above the platform. He had been the High Arbiter of the Conclave for over 200 years. He had overseen the rise and fall of civilizations. He had never, in all that time, seen anything like this. He looked at Danny Cole, seated quietly in the minor species section, and for the first time in his long life, Sci-Fi Voss was not sure what was going to happen next. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then the chamber exploded. Delegates from a dozen species began shouting at once. Some stood from their seats. Others turned to their aides and translators, demanding confirmation of what they had just heard. The translation systems embedded in the walls struggled to keep up with the overlapping voices, producing a garbled wall of sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Sci-Fi Voss slammed his clawed hand against the stone podium. The impact sent a deep boom rolling through the chamber, and the noise died down just enough for his voice to cut through. "Order," he said. The single word carried the weight of 9,000 years of authority. The delegates fell silent. Though many remained standing, their attention locked on the small human at the speaker's platform. Sci-Fi Voss turned his golden eyes on Danny Cole. His expression had changed. The boredom was gone. In its place was something cold and sharp, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "That is a very serious accusation," Sci-Fi Voss said slowly, "and a very foolish one. The Dominion has no interest in your world. No fleet has been dispatched to human space. What you are suggesting is not only false, it is an insult to this conclave, and to every species represented here." Danny did not respond immediately. He stood calmly, his hands still clasped behind his back, and let the arbiter's words settle over the chamber. Then he turned his head slightly and nodded to Katie Morgan. Katie stepped forward, her tablet already open. She tapped the surface twice, and a holographic projection appeared above the speaker's platform, large enough for every delegate in the chamber to see clearly. The first image was a wide-angle recording captured by an orbital defense satellite positioned above Earth's northern hemisphere. It showed the black emptiness of space beyond the moon, and then, appearing in a sudden flash of distorted light, 12 warships dropping out of faster-than-light transit. The ships were enormous, each one over a mile long, with angular hulls covered in dark plating and energy arrays that glowed faint red along their spines. The recording continued. The 12 ships moved into formation around Earth's orbit with practiced precision. Then they opened fire. Bright white beams of focused energy lanced downward through the atmosphere, striking 3 locations on the planet's surface. The beams lasted for 11 minutes. When they stopped, the ships turned, accelerated, and vanished back into faster-than-light transit, without transmitting a single message. The chamber was silent again. But this silence was different. It was the silence of people watching something they could not look away from. Katie advanced to the next image. Close-up footage of the lead warship's hull, captured by a long-range telescope array on Earth's moon. The image was clear enough to show the markings painted on the ship's port side. Dominion military script, identifying the vessel as part of the 7th Expansion Fleet, a formation well known across the galaxy for enforcing compliance among Outer Rim worlds. 212,000 people died, Danny said. His voice was the same as before, calm and level, as if he were reading a weather report. 3 cities were partially destroyed. The attack lasted 11 minutes. No warning was given. No demands were made. No communication of any kind was attempted. He paused and looked directly at Sci-Fi Voss. "We buried our dead," Danny said, "and then we started asking questions." Sci-Fi Voss recovered faster than most would have. He straightened to his full height, towering over the platform, and spoke with a voice that dripped with authority. "This footage proves nothing. Your species lacks the sensor capability to accurately identify Dominion vessels. These recordings could have been altered, fabricated, or misinterpreted. I will not allow this conclave to be disrupted by the desperate inventions of a minor civilization seeking political sympathy. A murmur of agreement rippled through a few of the upper rows, mostly from species closely allied with the Dominion. But many other delegates remained silent, watching closely. Danny did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned to Katie again and nodded once. Katie tapped her tablet. A data transmission went out simultaneously to every delegation in the chamber. 600 devices chimed at once as the file arrived. What you have just received, Danny said, is the full, unedited sensor data package from every orbital platform, ground station, and deep space array that was active during the attack. It includes energy signature analysis, trajectory mapping, and sublight engine emission profiles, all of which match Dominion military specifications that are already part of the public galactic registry. He waited a moment, then added, it also includes something else. Katie brought up the final projection. It showed a series of intercepted subspace communications, displayed in their original format. The messages were written in the Dominion's own classified military cipher, a code that was supposed to be unbreakable by any species outside the Dominion's intelligence apparatus. These are the original orders, Danny said, transmitted from a Dominion military command node to the 7th Expansion Fleet, authorizing the strike on Earth. Our intelligence division decoded them 8 months ago. The chamber erupted again, but this time the noise was different. It was not outrage directed at Danny. It was confusion, alarm, and in some corners, fear. Several alien diplomats were already reading through the transmitted data on their own devices, their faces changing as they realized what they were looking at. Zethar Voss stared at Danny from behind the podium. His golden eyes had narrowed to thin slits. His claws gripped the edge of the stone so tightly that small cracks appeared under his fingers. Danny looked back at him without flinching. He had been a diplomat for 12 years. Before that, he had been a negotiator for disaster relief operations in 3 different war zones back on Earth. He had sat across from warlords, dictators, and desperate men with guns. A 9-foot lizard with a title did not scare him. I understand that this is difficult to hear, Danny said, and his tone carried no sarcasm, only a flat, steady certainty. I understand that many of you may not have known about this attack. Some of you may have heard rumors and chosen to dismiss them. Some of you may have been deliberately kept in the dark. He took a single step forward. But the evidence is in front of you now. It is complete, it is verified, and it is not going away. He let that sit for a moment, watching the ripple of unease move through the rows of delegates like a wave through water. We did not come here to beg, Danny said. We did not come here to plead for justice from a body that may have allowed this to happen. We came here to inform you, all of you, of what has already been done and what happens next. Zethar Voss opened his mouth to speak, but Danny continued before he could. 14 months ago, after we buried 212,000 of our people, Earth went silent. We closed our trade routes. We shut down our communication relays. We pulled every ship back to human space. Most of you probably assumed we had collapsed, that we had crawled into a corner to die quietly. He paused. The chamber was hanging on every word now. Even the delegates who had laughed at him minutes ago were leaning forward in their seats. You were wrong, Danny said. He looked at Katie. She closed the current projection and prepared the next file. What I am about to show you, Danny said, is what humanity has been doing for the last 14 months. Katie opened the file, and for the first time in the history of the Conclave of Sovereigns, a minor species made the entire galaxy hold its breath.